Good evening. I'm Mark Evanier, and this is another one of my silly little webcasts. I started these when the pandemic was going because I thought, well, I'm going to be isolated a lot. Maybe it'd be nice to talk to some friend of mine for a while every night. And it turned into, hey, I could, get them on a viewing screen and I could see them at the same time. And then it turned into, hey, why don't I let everybody sit in? So this evening, I get to spend some time talking with a friend of mine named Carl Gottlieb, who I've wanted to talk to a lot. Carl's a fascinating man. He was very involved in a lot of the revolutions in comedy that happened in the late 60s, early 70s. He was a catalyst, he was an actor, he was a writer, he was on the premises to witness them. Anytime I was reading about comedy revolutions of the period, his name kept popping up, and I was pleased to get to know him, which I think I did on the picket lines. And we'll also talk a little bit about that because he's been a very important person in the Writers Guild since before I even joined it. Would you welcome to this show my friend Carl Gottlieb? Thank you, sir, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Now, the story I always tell whenever Carl's around, and he's sick of hearing this, is that about 10, 12 years ago, I had this lovely friend named Carolyn Kelly. She was my girlfriend for many years. We got along great. One of the little differences we had stemmed from the fact that she had never owned a television and didn't know who anybody was who was famous in show business. And one night we were at a restaurant and we ran into Gary Shandling, and Gary and I were talking for 15, 20 minutes just about mutual friends and projects and things, and she had no idea who that was. So after we parted, she turned to me and she said, listen, from now on, whenever you see one of your friends, one of these guys we run into, would you just whisper to me who he is so I don't feel like a complete ninny during the conversation and I can feel like a part of it. So I didn't know who he is. I didn't know that guy was a performer until late in the conversation. I said, fine, I'll do that. A couple weeks later, we're at Farmer's Market. I look over and I see Carl walking towards me to say hello. And I whisper to Carolyn who Carl is. And we talked about different things. It was a nice little conversation. And we ended saying, hey, listen, we got to get together for lunch sometime. Fine. And Carl walked off. And Carolyn turned to me and she said, he's very nice. I said, yeah, he's a very nice man, one of the nicest people I know. And she said, and he seemed very smart. I said, oh, yeah, he's a very smart guy. He's been wonderful with the Guild. He's written some wonderful movies and TV shows and such. Very, very smart man. And she said, so why did you say he was a jerk? And I said, no. I said, he wrote The Jerk. and she goes, oh, okay, fine. Anyway, this story amuses me because it is Carl wrote a movie that is the exact antithesis of who he is in the name. And you must put up with that a lot, like you appear someplace and they'll say, and on the dais will be Carl Gottlieb, parentheses, the jerk, and such. I want to talk about your career and all sorts of things. I know the thing that you least want to spend time talking about because you've discussed it so much is the movie Jaws.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get this out of the way. We're going to get all the Jaws talk out of the way in about 3 minutes here, because my friend Amber, who replaced Carolyn in my life, thinks that is the greatest movie ever made. And she wrote to me, I love the movie Jaws. Ask him what his favorite scene in the movie was and how it was working with Roy Scheider, who's one of my favorite actors. Okay. What's your favorite scene in the movie?
It's actually, it's one of the few scenes that I'm in. I like the scene on the dock with the shark, the dead shark, and the crowd standing around, and I'm trying to get pictures for the paper. And then the mood is broken by the arrival of the mother of the first victim. The woman in black comes and gives a very moving speech to Scheider about how he fucked up and her son is dead and there's nothing he can do about it. And then she slaps him. And it's just a very well acted, very, very nice scene. And the dialogue was written almost at the day or two before. I was writing under the gun at that point, and I knew the scene was coming up. And I wrote I wrote a speech, and she was a professional actress, and she memorized the lines, and she did that thing that we always love that actors do, which is she read the speech the way it was written and added her craft as an actor to make it that much more meaningful and moving. So I like that scene. And I also like the scene where Dreyfus and Scheider are trying to convince the mayor that there's a shark. It's a scene in front of a billboard on which somebody has painted a shark. And it's a lot of dialogue, and Spielberg shot it beautifully. It's, starts as a wide shot, then it becomes a two shot, then it's a solo, and the camera keeps moving. So there's very few cuts in the scene, but yet it's completely covered. You're on Scheider when Scheider's speaking, you're on Dreyfus when Dreyfus is speaking, you're on Murray Hamilton when it's important to hear what he says. It's just a beautifully rendered scene. And, it's just, all the other stuff in the movie is showy and fabulous, and, the big scare moments and everything else. And I'm happy that all those things are in it. But those are the scenes that I look for, because they were scenes that I wrote and were performed as written. And that's always a treat.
You didn't change your own lines, in other words. Okay.
Well, I wrote myself out, and I ad-libbed a lot of my lines. But I have a friend in New York named Dave Axelrod, whose name I threw into my speech. I'm talking about the newspaper and taking pictures for the paper. I'm telling my assistant, call Dave Axelrod in New York, tell him he owes me a favor. And my friend is dined out on the fact that his name is mentioned in Shaw's ever since.
Now,
and I'm fond of saying that if I was a Jeopardy category, it would be his hits begin with a J.
Well, okay. Now, I remember a friend of mine, and I'll bet you crossed paths with him at some point. Stanley Ralph Ross.
Oh, sure.
Okay, Stanley we were once talking, and your name came up in the conversation, and Stanley said you had committed. Now, you tell me if this is true or not. The greatest sin, as far as he was concerned, for a screenwriter who was also an actor, and this really, I think, bothered him because of the way he approached being a writer and a performer and things. He said Carl was hard to rewrite this movie, and he made his part smaller, which Stanley would have given himself more dialogue than Roy Scheider if he'd done the rewrite on that film. But you cut yourself back, as his story is.
Yeah, they're absolutely true. And there was a technical reason for it. There was a scene in which Scheider and Dreyfus and me, the editor of the paper, are out looking for Ben Gardner, and we find his boat, and then when you pull up alongside, we find that he's dead. It's the genesis for the head popping out of the boat shriek. It's the biggest scream in the movie. But when we filmed it, it was filmed in the day, and Freddie Zendar, who was the boat advisor, was piloting the boat. Dreyfus had no idea how to drive a boat. He was, Beverly Hills high school boy, never been on the water. So, but he had to pretend to be this, oceanographer. So he's pretending to pilot the boat, and he's pulling us alongside. And my job, both as an actor and a character, was to reach over, grab the line from this boat that's wrecked and wallowing in the water, and tie us alongside so we can see what's going on. So I'm leaning over on the first take, and we're doing it with this 4 cameras on running, plus a documentary crew from the BBC who's there shooting this as a bystander camera. And I lean over too far, my center of gravity shifts, and I go over the side of the boat headfirst into the water. They cut. They pull me out of the water. And because I'm not a principal, I had a good role in the movie. I mean, if you look at the original release prints, I have co-star billing with Lorraine Gary and Murray Hamilton in the early release prints, and on the first VHS copies, it says, Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, Robert Shaw in Jaws, with Lorraine Gary, Murray Hamilton, and Carl Gottlieb. There's good billing, good part. So I fall in the water, but because they had not doubled my wardrobe, or even they had to wait for my clothes to dry before they could do take two. And it was only 3 days into the shoot. And Steven said, "We'll come back for this. You know, I don't want to lose a half day waiting for a costume to dry." So we scrapped it. We said, "Okay, we'll do it later." So that scene was out of the movie, and now we finish pretty much shooting the movie, and that the scene of discovering the boat has not been covered. It's never been shot. So we decide, Steven's decision, okay, we'll do this after we get back to LA. We'll shoot it on the back lot. We'll go on the lake and shoot it. Instead of doing it during the day, because we'll never double Nantucket Sound in Los Angeles, even if we go out to Catalina, and we can't afford to do the retake. So we'll pick up the shot however we can. So Verna Fields had a little swimming pool, and she was cutting the film in her garage. She had an editorial set up in her garage. So when Steven said, "Okay," they scavenged pieces of the boat from the Universal lot, and Steven said, "I'll pay for this myself. I need this. I need this scene. I need another scream in the movie." So we cobbled together this scene, and there was a stunt double for Dreyfuss, Frank Sparks, and we shot the scene in Verna Field's swimming pool with a fake boat and we had the cast of the actor Craig Kingsbury with the eye bulging out, and we made the shot in a little swimming pool in Van Nuys, winter afternoon in 1974, and it's the biggest scream in the movie, and to this day, and always was. But in the course of rewriting the script to allow for that, I essentially wrote myself out of the movie, and I always point to that as this is how selfless I am as a writer.
Stanley would never have done that. Never.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Amber wanted to know how it was working with Roy Scheider.
Scheider was great. He was a real New York actor. It was really an interesting trio, that ensemble, because you had Shaw, who was a classically trained English actor, a drunk, and
do those two things go together?
Yeah, Richard Harris. I mean, just think Peter O'Toole, Richard Harris,
okay,
all those guys, Bob Hoskins, all those London and RADA actors. So you had Shaw, classically trained, also a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. Most people don't know that. Then you had Richard Dreyfuss, who was a Beverly Hills high school kid who started acting very early and played, was doing TV shows when he was still in high school. And then you had Roy Scheider, who was a New York actor, very dedicated, kind of methody. He had only done French Connection and the 7-Ups. He was like a cop actor in New York. And he was the first one cast. Steven cast him before anybody else. And he was a pleasure to work with. Whenever he thought of an ad lib, he'd check with me. Most of the time, he'd ask me, "Can I say this?" And I'd say, "Yeah, the character would say that. You're in character, sure." Or I would suggest, an alternate version. You try it both ways. So at one point, he says the line, "We're going to need a bigger boat," which is the line from the picture that everybody remembers. Now, for years, I always said that I'd love to take credit for that line, but Roy ad-libbed it. Then one year, not while he was still alive, somebody pointed me in the direction of the Blu-ray release of Jaws with extra materials, and there's a documentary with Roy Scheider saying and being asked about that line, and he said, no, that was in the script. So I said, shit, I've been turning down credit for this. I was very modest. because everybody else was getting. I mean, the Writers Guild did a whole campaign called "Somebody Wrote That," where they took billboard ads with writers, pictures on them, and classic lines. What we have here is failure to communicate, or with
They
the
all had the line on it. Somebody wrote that.
yeah,
And I always wondered who wrote "Somebody Wrote That." They didn't credit the guy.
somebody in the PR department at the Guild. I think. So, and then Roy elaborates a little bit on it. We had a problem with support boats for the shooting, and we had a shitty boat called the SS Garage Sail, which was essentially a barge that had to be towed out into the water, and the Orca had to be towed out and anchored, and they would have to schlep equipment and stuff. And they kept agitating for a bigger boat because the garage sail was not adequate to the task. And finally, Zanuck and Brown were stingy bastards, but they finally realized that they were losing shooting time because of the boat. So they finally chartered the boat that they should have gotten from the start, which was a big ocean-going tug based in the Vineyard called the Whitefoot. And that became the support boat. And that was great because it had a kitchen and a bunks and a place for the actors to relax between takes. And it was the bigger boat that we needed. So we're going to need a bigger boat became a catchphrase for when anything went wrong in the production before we got the bigger boat. Anything, if somebody dropped a thing in the water, a light blew up, camera ran out of film, the Orca sank unexpectedly. Everybody would say, well, we're going to need a bigger boat. So Roy had ad-libbed that line in a dozen different situations during the making of the movie. And when he ad-libbed it after seeing the shark for the first time, and then the double shock moment, with a laugh in there also, he said, we're going to need a bigger boat. And so it became the most popular line from the movie. But I bless him for finally taking credit for acknowledging that there was a writer on the movie who probably either wrote that line or wrote the ad lib that became that line. So
Okay.
that's
well, anyway, good. Anyway, thank you for all that. Thank you, Amber, for the questions. If you saw Amber, you'd know why I have to do what she tells me. Anyway, let's go back in your career a bit here. I want to talk about a thing called the committee. Now, I'm fascinated by the history of improv comedy, and most of the groups, I know a lot about Second City. I know a lot about the Groundlings. I know a lot about the various Viola Spolin spin-offs and satellites and such. I don't know as much about the committee as I should. Why was the committee important, apart from the fact that you were in it?
What happened was a Second City director named Alan Meyerson was married to a Second City actress named Irene Reardon, was her real name. But there was already an actress in the Screen Actors Guild with that name, so she had to change her name to Irene Ryan. And Alan was directing Second City when they were in New York at some venue down in Washington Square. And he was very socially conscious, very political. And for all of Second City's genius, they were not political. They did social satire, but they did not do political satire. So Alan and Jessica said, well, why don't we start our own theater? You know how to do this. I know how to do this. We'll go somewhere, raise money, we'll open a theater. So they scouted around and they decided San Francisco was a good venue. They were torn between LA and San Francisco, but Second City had been in LA in a company that featured Larry Tucker, Paul Mazursky and Larry Tucker, and it had not done well. So they go, all right, well, San Francisco, hip town, college community, Berkeley, just across the bay. So they went to San Francisco, and all they had was a bunch of audio tapes of Second City shows that Alan had directed with Severin Darden and Del Close and all those actors. And they started beating the bushes for backers. And they found some very interesting backers. Jessica Mitford, who wrote an author, and had her husband. They were early backers. And there was, they found a venue, which was an old bocce ball court in North Beach called the Bocce Ball, right on Broadway in North Beach. And they raised, it's amazing, they raised $60,000. And that was enough. They took a lease on the Bocce Ball. They hired a company of actors that included Hamilton Camp and Gary Goodrow and a local guy named Scott Beach, who was a radio actor and a very smart guy.
For the benefit of people who watch this type of thing, Scott Beach was the first voice of Garfield the cat when it was first time it was animated.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on. And Larry Hankin was in the group.
Larry Hankin, Gary Goodrow. The company was Larry Hankin, Gary Goodrow, Jessica Meyerson, Catherine Ish, Dick Stahl, Mel Stewart, who's a black actor, Gary Scott, Larry Hankin,
Hamilton.
And Hamilton. That's five women and two men, the standard improv cast.
Yeah.
And they all went to LA. They met the San Francisco Mime Troupe, guy named Ronnie Davis. There was an avant-garde theater group called the San Francisco Mime Troupe that worked in a church on Cap Street. Anyway, so Ronnie lent them the church to rehearse in while the Bocce Ball was remodeled and turned into a venue for us. And there was a couple other backers who came up with all the money that they needed. And after rehearsing for a while, they opened and got surprisingly good reviews from the two San Francisco dailies and the underground press, the Berkeley Barb and Weekly Variety. And the show was a hit from the day it opened in April of '63. Now, in 1963, in April, I was in the Army. I had been roommates with Larry Hankin in Greenwich Village because we had gone to Syracuse University together. And in '60, when I graduated, Larry graduated, we got an apartment in the Village. Then I got drafted and I went into the Army. Larry stayed in the apartment. And then while I was in St. Louis, in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, I read in the paper that Compass Theater is opening in St. Louis with Larry Hankin as an actor. So I go, shit, my roommate's going to be just down the road from Fort Leonard Wood. So on the weekend pass, I would go into St. Louis and I would hang out with the Compass Theater players, which was Larry Hankin, Jack Burns, a guy named Martin Levatt, a woman named Hilda Bronner. It was directed by a guy named David Shepard, who was one of the founders of Compass Theater Second City, if you go back to Viola Spolin Day. So there was this ancestor company, which was probably the second improvisational company in the world after Playwrights Theater in Chicago, Roger Bowen also. So the original improvisational theater, Playwrights Theater at the University of Chicago, in the neighborhood of the University of Chicago. And then that became Second City, and Paul Sills of Viola Spolin became active, and they hired Larry Hankin, among other people, to fill out the company. So when Compass Theater closed in St. Louis, Larry went up to St. Louis, to Chicago, to be in Second City. And he had the misfortune of being in the same company with Richard Libertini. And Viola Spolin said, you can't have two funny-looking guys with big noses in the same company. So they let Larry go. And at that moment, Alan Meyerson blew through Chicago to pick up Hamilton Camp, and he saw that Larry Hankin was available, so he hired him. And they all drove to San Francisco and went into rehearsal to open the committee. And I was aware of this. Now, 2 months later, I'm a finalist in the All-Army Entertainment Contest in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, or someplace. And I lose, but I get a furlough, and I go to visit my friend Larry in San Francisco and see this new company that he's working with. So it's now, the committee's been open for 2 months. They're a hit. I'm hanging out with them. They go to do a Monday night concert gig. They need a stage manager. I go along with them. I set up the chairs. I set up the lights. And they say, when do you get out of the Army? I said, well, probably in the fall. I said, well, we need a stage manager. Could you be our stage manager? And I said, sure. And then I went back to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and I was a company clerk. I was very much like XPFC Wintergreen in Catch 22. I was a wheeler dealer. And I read the Army regulations, and it was a provision in the regulations that allowed you an early discharge to accept employment of a seasonal nature. This was a regulation that was written for draftees who worked as migrant farm workers or as Alaskan fishermen. And if they missed the season, they'd be shit out of luck for a year. So you could get out of the Army 90 days early, up to 90 days early, if you had a job that was seasonal. I read the regulations, and summer stock theater qualified as seasonal employment. So I applied for early release to accept employment of a seasonal nature at the Plattsburgh Summer Theater, where Hankin and I had worked for a couple of summers. And after a lot of equivocating, I was granted early release. So I got out of the Army. I went to Plattsburgh Summer Theater to do 3 weeks because that was my seasonal employment. And then as soon as that was over, I drove to San Francisco and went to work in the committee as their first stage manager, and with Larry and Hamilton and everybody else. And it changed my life, and it was, it was great.
What were you planning to do with your life prior to that?
When I graduated university, I went to Syracuse, and I had transferred, so I was missing like 9 credits, so I had to stay a half semester extra and make up the credits. So I graduated in January. I was originally class of 59. I graduated in January of 60. It was winter. There was no ceremony. It was just one day I was in college, and then the next day I was out. And I remember the one vow I made to myself. I said, okay, I am not going to do anything that's not related to my dual majors of theater and journalism. I'm going to either be in show business, or I'm going to write about show business, or I'm going to write for show business. At that time, I thought I wanted to be Brooks Atkinson and be a theater critic, or Kenneth Tynan.
I think you had too much taste, but okay, it's all right. Yeah.
So I vowed only to work in show business. And I got out of the Army, and the first jobs I got were stage manager and a lighting guy, and I worked in Greenwich Village, and I got jobs that enabled me to live. And I never was a cab driver or a merchant seaman. All those dust jacket of your novel jobs, the merchant seaman for. I did work as a fry cook in college, but I never worked at anything other than show business or writing. And one job led to another. And at first I was getting $25 a week and meals in a coffee house in Greenwich Village, doing the lights and sound, and emceeing on talent night. So I was, developing this craft of being on stage. And it was Greenwich Village. It was 1961. It was a great time to be there. Dylan was there. Everybody, Peter, Paul, and Mary had just gotten together. Paul was the highest paid performer in the village because he anchored the Cafe Wa on Bleecker Street. Anyway, so I was involved in this scene, and I never, like I say, one job led to another. And,
Now, did the committee lead to the Smothers Brothers?
Yes, because what happened was I worked at the committee for 2 years, during 63 to 65. In 65, the committee went to Broadway and played a limited run on Broadway. And because I was a stage manager, I stayed behind and directed the interim company. They didn't want to close the theater; they would lose momentum, and they were buying a second theater in San Francisco. They were going to do improvised plays. They had a lot of ambition. So I stayed behind and directed the caretaker company, which was Avery Schreiber and Dick Shaw and some other people. I forget, an actor named Stanley Wagner. Anyway, so I was a director, and then they came back from Broadway, and I was demoted back to stage manager. And since director owned the theater and he wasn't going anywhere, I realized, it was kind of a dead end for me. I was going to be doomed to be a stage manager or, standby director. And meanwhile, I had 2 offers of jobs in New York. One from a Broadway producer who had done the committee, and the other one from the Albert Grossman office to be a road manager for Peter, Paul, and Mary. So I felt justified in leaving the committee and going to New York to re-seek my fortune. So I got to New York, and Mary was pregnant, and they were only touring on the weekends, and they had trained the pilot and co-pilot of their private plane to do the road manager chores, so they didn't need a road manager. So my job with Arthur Cantor as an assistant was my job. So I got a job. I had an office in the Sardis building on 44th Street. I worked for a Broadway producer. He wanted to direct, and I was his company manager for a play that he did off Broadway. And I read scripts. I did everything that an assistant to the producer does. And I could cash checks at the bar at Sardis. I could meet people down there. I had my office had a view. I was on the 11th floor of the Sardis building, overlooking Schubert Alley. I mean, I was Broadway. I mean, it was a dream come true, even though I was getting paid $85 a week. And so now I'm in Broadway, on Broadway, and Alan Meyerson calls, and they're opening the second theater in San Francisco, and he wants me to help him audition New York actors to come to San Francisco. And I'm in New York, and I have access to the trades, and I have an office. So I facilitate the audition process for New York actors for the committee. I hired a hall, and you don't audition for improv the way you audition for a movie role. There's no sides. You don't memorize anything. You go in and you play theater games, and how well you play the games indicates to some degree what kind of improviser you'll be. So now I'm coaching the actors, and I'm walking through scenes with them. And after a couple of days of this, I turned to Alan. I said, "Hey, I'm having a good time doing this. I've done everything else at the committee. I was a stage manager. I was a director. I helped in the kitchen. I sold, I waited table. Maybe I can come back as an actor, since you're auditioning actors anyway." So Meyerson says, "Well, Peter Bonners is directing the company. Let me ask him." So Peter Bonner says, "Yeah, yes, I'd love to have Carl as an actor." So in the spring of '66, after a season on Broadway, during which, by the way, I sold my first big money article to Esquire magazine. So now I was a published author. I took my money from Esquire. I bought a motorcycle, and the motorcycle. I drove a motorcycle around the streets of New York. There was a subway strike that year, and I had a motorcycle, so I was driving around the city on my bike. I packed the bike in the trailer, and I drove to San Francisco. And I got there, and I became an actor, and that changed my life. Because now, when we opened in San Francisco, we got unanimous rave reviews across the board. The show was a huge hit. So I was an actor in a hit show, no shortage of lady friends. I mean, it was the best of all possible worlds, and to this day is my happiest memories are of that period. San Francisco, 66 to 68, and it was the summer of love and the Haight-Ashbury and Jefferson Airplane and Crosby, Stills and Nash, and all my friends. I made all my friends in rock and roll at that point, and the committee was kind of like rock and roll. We all did benefits for the same progressive causes. We were all heroes to the Berkeley student population. So we had a lot of cred as progressives, and we could do no wrong. So in '68, after 2 years of celebrity stardom, the show moved to a venue in Los Angeles. Why leave that market untapped? We found a theater. They found a theater, the Tiffany Theater on the Sunset Strip, which was a converted movie house, but it was a 350-seat auditorium with a dressing room and a stage. And we took it over, and it became the committee, and we played on the Sunset Strip for 2 years. I rented a big house. Four actors shared a house on Queens Road, just around the corner. We could walk to work, and it was the second best time of my life because now we were stars, and we were stars in LA. The show, when we opened the show in Los Angeles, we got, again, raves from Herald Examiner, Los Angeles Times, LA Free Press, the Avatar, Daily Variety, Weekly Variety, and the Hollywood Reporter were all raves. So we were on top of the world.
Now, the story of most improv groups or most theater actual companies like this is then somebody comes along and starts hiring them away for better money jobs in television or motion pictures, and that kind of ate away at a lot of improv groups, and the success of the improv groups has something to do with how famous the people in it became later.
Yeah.
I mean, when everybody talks about a great improv group, they say, oh yeah, this guy got his start there, that lady got her start there, and things like that. So that got you into the Smothers Brothers?
The Smothers Brothers came to see, well, everybody came to see the show. I was cast, I was in the original film of MASH because Altman had seen the show and he hired me. And
there were a lot of people with improv backgrounds in MASH. Roger Bowen was in it, and
Danny Goldman, Corey Fisher, a woman named Tamara Horrocks who came from a New York company. Yeah, Altman encouraged improvisation, so we loved him.
Did you do a lot of stuff that didn't get into the film?
No, most of my stuff got into the film. I didn't have that much to do. But I was a principal, and my biggest laugh, you can't tell it's me. During the football game, it's during an operating room scene. I'm operating on somebody, and we're all wearing surgical masks, and everybody is masked and gowned, and there's an Altman-like multi-track chatter going on, and you hear my voice saying, is this an officer or an enlisted man? And somebody says, enlisted man. And I said, make the stitches big.
All right. Now, when you were hired on the Smothers Brothers show, were you considered a writer or a writer performer?
Writer performer. Well, here's what happened. In those days, this is again late '60s. If you had a hit show on television, mostly musical variety, they would give you your time slot and a much reduced license fee, and you could produce your own replacement. So the Smothers Brothers found Glenn Campbell, who had just had a hit with Gentle on My Mind. So they proposed a show for CBS called the Summer Brothers Smothers Show. And because they had just inherited ownership of their corporate entity from the two old-time producers who had guided the Smothers Brothers show for the first two seasons, by the '68-'69 season, they owned their show and they owned their time slot, and they wanted to they gave it to Glenn Campbell, and they hired John Hartford as a writer performer on the show because he wrote Gentle on My Mind. And then they wanted other younger, smarter, not old radio TV writers. They wanted fresh blood. So they hired me, Steve Martin, Murray Roman, Bob Einstein, a guy named Paul Wayne, and who wrote mostly Pat Paulson's material. And they hired us as writers on the Summer Brothers Smothers show. So we all went to work and got our Screenwriters Guild cards. We wrote the Glenn Campbell show. And it was great because I was commuting. Glenn Campbell show taped on, I think, Tuesdays. So I could work at the committee during the week. And then on Tuesday nights, I would go shoot the show on. I'd work days at CBS and nights at the committee. Everything was going great. This show was Glenn Campbell was a hit. The show was doing well. So when CBS picked and other summer shows, Marilyn McCoo and Billy Davis had a show. The Fifth Dimension had a show. There were all kinds of shows that summer that started as music acts got their own television show. What they didn't understand in television, because it was a 3-network universe, what they didn't understand, that even if you had a double platinum record and everybody who bought the record watched television, it was only a drop in the Nielsen bucket. You could not get TV ratings with a recording star. They discovered that too late. All these recording stars got summer shows and none of them got ratings because in those days you needed a 30, 40 share and 30 million viewers. And,
On these, okay, I'm sorry. Finish what you're saying. I'm sorry.
So nobody got that. So, but in any case, the Smothers Brothers went back on their winter season. They hired all these new writers, all the guys who'd done this Campbell show. We all got hired to do the Smothers show. I had to quit the committee because the Smothers taped on Friday and I could not work 2 jobs anymore. So I went to work at CBS Television City with all those same guys, Bob Einstein, Alan Bly, Chris Beard, John Hartford, Steve Martin.
When did Mr. Music come in here? It was Jerry then.
Jerry, at that time, he was one of the first. He was an early. The Smothers Brothers had hired him a season earlier, based on his act with Jerry and Myrna Music.
Yeah.
So he was already on the show, and they teamed.
And for those who don't know, Jerry Music became Lorenzo Music.
Right. The second voice of Garfield the cat.
That's right. Yes, we're just working our way through those. Now, when you were writing for these shows, I wrote a mess of variety shows years later, and sometimes we wrote with everybody in the room, and sometimes everybody would run off to their own private offices and write. Did you write individually, or did you write with 9 guys in the room, or which method?
We were nominally paired. I worked with Lorenzo, and we were a good partnership. We specialized in monologues for the brothers, because the first few seasons the brothers could do their act, but eventually they ran out of material, And our job was to write them as good as they wrote themselves. And I'm happy to say that Lorenzo and I could do that. So we specialize in writing material for the boys. We wrote sketches, and Chris Beard and Alan Bly were very generous with the writers. They rotated the head writer job around the staff. Everybody got to be a head writer for a week. And the show that I was head writer, the co-head writer, I wrote a sketch for Bob Newhart, was a guest on that show. And Newhart loved the sketch so much he bought it from us to be in his act. Bought it from me and Lorenzo.
Which was that? What was the sketch?
The sketch is the air traffic controller.
Oh, okay. I know that sketch.
Yeah. And Lorenzo, and to the credit of Beard and Bly, they own the material. I mean, we were being paid. We were writers for hire when we wrote it for the show. But when Newhart said he wanted to do it on his album, he said, make your own deal with the boys, and he let us make our own deal. I'm still waiting for record royalties because I think it was I don't think Newhart ever put it on an album, but it became part of his act for decades.
I think it was on an album. I think I've got it someplace. I'll dig it out and let you know. But okay, so now I'm rushing you a little bit here because we got a lot more to talk about.
I can go on and on about this.
Yeah. So you were present when Tommy began to have his problems with CBS.
Yes.
Okay.
Very much so.
Now let me see if I can ask this question this way. Do you think he handled it all wisely?
No. It became a pissing contest between him and Bob Wright, who was, I think, one of the senior network executives. And Tommy started doing stuff that was deliberately provocative. And eventually, he would delay delivery of the tape to New York because if the network could not preview it, they could not censor it. So on every Friday afternoon, an intern would take the edited 2-inch master on his lap on an airplane to New York, deliver it 24 hours before airtime to CBS, and they would not have a chance to review it. The only thing they had time to do was put it on a closed circuit network feed to the affiliates. So if the affiliates saw something they didn't like, they could censor it locally. We only found this out later with the lawsuit. So, like when we had Joan Baez on the show, they cut her introduction and it made Tommy furious. But he was delaying delivery, and eventually CBS said, you're not following the terms of your contract as the delivery of master materials. And so we're canceling the show. And then we won the Emmy that year. We were canceled and we won the Emmy. And the best part of it was because it was hiring season was over, we had all thought we were picked up because we had been. They picked us up for the fall season. And then because of the animosity between Tommy and the network, the show was canceled. We were left without jobs. So everybody made the point is, look, by contract, all these writers have a guarantee of 13 episodes or 7 out of 13, whatever our price was. Don't hold them hostage while you settle this lawsuit. So somebody, I don't know whether CBS or some others, they paid off our contracts while this thing worked its way through the courts. So I got paid for writing 13 episodes I never had to write. Best paycheck I ever got.
Now, it has just dawned on me. A theme of these webcasts and things is unusual connections.
Yeah.
You made the connection between Scott Beach as the first voice of Garfield and Lorenzo Music as the second. When I was doing the Garfield cartoons and I was working on them, we had a fight at one point over not an episode. It was a contract dispute between Lorenzo and the company, the Alpo company, which was doing Garfield commercials for Garfield endorsed cat foods.
Yeah.
And Lorenzo got replaced for about 3 commercials by someone else who became, therefore, the third voice of Garfield. Do you know who that person was?
No.
Tom Smothers.
Ah,
Tommy Smothers. There are Garfield commercials on YouTube that have Tommy Smothers doing the voice of Garfield. Then Lorenzo made his deal, and Tom never did it again. But so now we've been to 3 voice. The 4th voice of Garfield is a man named Frank Welker, and I don't know if you've ever worked with Frank, but
he was a comic and impressionist. Very good impressionist.
That's right. Yes, amazing fellow. But anyway, you haven't. You'll get to him anyway. From Smothers Brothers, I believe you went to Music Scene. Was that
Yes.
there? Was okay. And that show, while it was not a huge success, spawned an awful lot of careers.
Yes.
And most notably Ms. Tomlin's,
right.
and such. And then you just kept doing all sorts of different things. You pop up all sorts of places. Yeah. I was watching an episode of the Ken Berry Wow Show.
Oh, yes. It was a regular.
Yeah.
Me and Terry Garr and Billy Van and Don Lane and Cheryl Stoppelmoor, who later became Cheryl Ladd.
Yes. Anyway, that was a Chris Beard and Alan Bly show.
Yes,
because I worked with Chris a few times, and he kept saying, "I do the same show everywhere I go." And there had to be animation in the opening titles. There had to be certain kind of segues. Anyway, and that show was on for about an hour and a half, I think, before it was. There weren't that many of them, but
it was the summer. I think it was a summer replacement show. It might have been. I think they did 13.
Okay. Now, I was told you were involved in a show that I found fascinating, and I don't know if I was correctly informed. Were you involved with the Sammy Davis, Sammy and Company show?
Absolutely. I was a writer. Me and Alan Thicke were the writers of the first 13 episodes of that show.
For people who don't remember that show, it was a once-a-week, hour-long syndicated, I believe, talk show for the NBC O&Os, if I'm not mistaken. And it ran in Los Angeles at 11:30 Sunday nights. On Saturday night, 11:30, they would run the Best of Carson, a rerun of Mr. Carson's show. And then they would put Sammy on in that slot Sunday nights. And at some point, Saturday Night Live came along, or other things they were trying to program, and that bumped Carson to Sunday nights, and I think that was the end of Sammy and Company, if I'm not mistaken. But the Sammy Company show was infamous, whatever word you want to use, for the fact that it seemed to be like a game show to see how much celebrities could praise each other.
Yes.
And it was later parodied on SCTV as the Sammy Maudlin show.
Yes.
Tell me, to what extent was that understood as the zeitgeist of the show? I mean,
here's when Sammy and I forget, it was probably a CMA package or something. But in any case, when Alan Thicke and I got hired as writers, the notion was it was going to be a talk show with comedy, with sketches. That was the Sammy and Company, and the company was an actor named Johnny Brown from Laugh-In. Forever billed as Laugh-In's Johnny Brown. He had no other credits. Joyce Gilson, the astrologer, who was at that time a Broadway star. Joyce, Sammy, Johnny Brown, a couple other people. I forget who else was on the show. But we had to.
William B. Williams was the announcer.
Avery Schreiber. I think Avery Schreiber was on the show. And that was the And Company. And Alan and I would write sketches for them, and he would do comedy bits. And Sammy, and the show, was flounder. I think it was a Metro Media show. It was a syndicated Metro Media show, I think. But in any case, it was made for syndication. I don't think it was made for a network. But in any case, after the first 13 episodes, they realized they weren't, the comedy was not selling the show. So they got rid of And Company and they made it the Sammy Davis Show. And we all got fired. Either we got fired or we moved on because there wasn't any comedy sketches to write. You were just writing, intros. Welcome, please, our next guest. And it became the Sammy Maudlin Show. And I cherished. I had a Sammy and Company jacket, cast and crew gift. And in '75 or '76, when I met John Belushi, he used to love watching Sammy Davis. It was they like SCTV. They all loved the inanity of Sammy's show. So I gave John my Sammy Davis jacket, and he was ecstatic. Best gift he ever got, and it was his size because it was extra large. But it was, like I say, it was a weird credit, and I'm happy I did it. Part of my past.
Okay.
Now, also the best part of it was when you work with Sammy Davis Jr., you are his best friend. It's not a put on. I mean, he invited us to see his show, and he was working at a dinner theater in Scottsdale. My wife and I went to see him there. And, and then when I left the show, that was the end of it. I never spoke to him again.
Yeah, well, I spent an evening with Mr. Davis one time. It was fascinating. It was like a show. He just put on a show for us.
Yeah.
He was fascinating and it was interesting. I wish that I could have taken the conversation we had and put it on YouTube like this, because he was telling all these stories about losing all their money in Vegas when the Will Maston Trio was playing there, and he was doing impressions of everybody he'd ever met. Fascinating man.
He was a protean talent. Before I ever met him, I saw him at the Copa in New York, and he was astonishing. He sang, he tap danced on a table, he played drums, he did comedy. There was nobody like him, it was just extraordinary to work with him. And when during that brief period when I was his best friend, I went to his house, and it's one of my sad show business stories. I saw he took us into a closet where his wardrobe was, and it was size of a studio apartment with every wardrobe, with every style of performance clothing that he ever wore. Nehru jackets, tuxedos, puffy sleeve shirts. I mean, Gucci jeans. I mean, everything he ever wore was in this closet. And then he had a trophy room where his grand piano was, with the Grammy and all his trophies. And I went in to look. He was like a one-man war against inflation. He was the ultimate consumer. He had like 100 Nikon cameras. He bought everything. Like Michael Jackson. So I'm looking at this trophy room, and there's some legitimate trophies. There's a Tony from Broadway from Golden Boy. There's a Grammy for Mr. Bojangles. But most of the trophies, all the lucite and silver, are like B'nai B'rith Man of the Year. Show up and we'll give you an award. And they were all show up and I'll give you an award. Awards. All the plaques and all, except for half a dozen legitimate trophies. But he was gesturing them to them and saying, and then kind of with false modesty said, "I guess I must be doing something right, eh?" And I didn't have the nerve to tell him, these are all, you got these for showing up.
Well, showing up is important in this world. Now, I'm gonna jump around here.
Sure.
Out of sequence here because we have to get to Caveman at some point here. My friend Scott Shaw loves the movie Caveman. I liked it too. I haven't seen it in a long time, but you directed and wrote that film.
I co-wrote it with Rudy DeLuca.
Okay, and I haven't talked to Rudy for a while. I gotta I don't know what he is up to.
We had a split over that.
Really? Okay. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about, okay, these are questions my friend Scott sent me about this movie, and this may just be for him. Any Jack Gilford stories?
No, Jack and Madeline Guilford Jack was blacklisted, and he was just happy to be working again. And Jack and Madeline sponsored a Passover Seder for the cast and crew of Caveman in Mexico City. We went to a synagogue and we had a real Seder.
Okay.
Courtesy of Jack and Madeline.
Okay. Now here's the most obscure question here. Were the huge red berries that get the chubby T-Rex so stoned fall off that cliff intentionally imitating the exact same huge red berries that get King Kong stoned in King Kong versus Godzilla? Do you have any idea what this question is talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about. I think the berries were a creation of the special effects department. They were built for the show. We needed something that it could be eaten or made a bush out of. So I think
But was it inspired by similar red berries in the movie King Kong versus Godzilla?
I don't think so, unless they did it unbeknownst to the director, unless the prop department got together with the art director and did that. But other dates, King Kong, when was King Kong Godzilla?
I don't know, unfortunately.
I've got my cell phone handy here. I'm gonna go King Kong versus Godzilla. King Kong versus Godzilla. Here it is.
Godzilla vs. Kong is a 2020 movie directed by Adam Wingard.
2020? No,
that's not the same movie. That's not the right movie here. Okay, hold on here. Let me get my iPad here. We're going to solve this.
There was
no matter what it takes.
The 1962 version of King Kong versus Godzilla.
That's probably what he's talking about.
Okay, and
apparently there are red berries that get King Kong stoned in King Kong versus Godzilla, and there are similar red berries that get the chubby T-Rex in Caveman stoned. And Scott is suggesting a parallel between these two red berries, like you had seen, or Rudy had seen the other film and decided to parody that or reference it.
Well, Rudy didn't have anything to do with the physical production. He was off the show by that time. But I don't remember ever making that connection. Nobody ever showed me the berries and said, "Here, they did this. Let's do these." They just showed them to me. I said, "Yeah, let's go with that."
Okay. Was it obvious that Ringo Starr was falling in love with Barbara Bach?
Yes.
Was John Matuszak difficult on or off the set?
John was only difficult on the set. Matuszak was a natural actor. He was gifted, amazingly gifted actor. We were on location in Puerto Vallarta, and he went nuts and started throwing cast iron pool furniture into the pool. And somebody came over to me. He says, "You're the only one he will listen to," because he always listened to his director. It's a hangover from his days as a player when coach was God. To John Matuszak, if you were director, you were like coach. You would do what you said. I was coach. So I went over. I said, "John, you're making a lot of people nervous here." He said, I know. It's expected of me." I said, "Well, just stop it first." This is the guy, by the way, who on the night before the Super Bowl broke curfew and was discovered walking the streets of New Orleans during Super Bowl, whatever it was, when the Raiders played the New Orleans Saints. And the reporters caught him. He said, "What are you doing? You're supposed to curfew. You got a game tomorrow." He says, "Yeah, I'm out rounding up the players that are breaking curfew."
Okay, now the last two questions here are about special effects in the film. You may not know the answers. What was the budget for the stop motion creatures? David Allen's team of animators did a great job.
Yep, it started as a Jim Danforth project. if you're an animation, if you're
I know I met Jim Danforth a few times. Yeah, yeah.
he actually painted a cover, one of the mats that we used. He was a matte painter also. Anyway, it started with Jim Danforth. He designed the creatures, and he designed them funny. And he had a falling out with the producers and was replaced by David Allen, who finished the show and did all the post-production. The creatures and the location photography, where we did the composite, we filmed the plates for the composites. Those were done with Danforth and David Allen on location. And Danforth would hold up a broom and say, "This is the creature. This is your eye line. Follow the broom." And he did the creatures, and he did a wonderful job. Danforth is a genius, and David Allen was a genius also for picking up and seamlessly integrating the footage into something that worked for the movie. As a matter of fact, I remember as an actor, director, performer kind of person, when the T-Rex gets stoned on the berries, I mimed for him the creature, losing, his little arms moving like this as he falls backward off the cliff. I mimed that, and he built that into the animation. So I inspired the creature action.
Okay. Now, now I don't remember this in the film. Is that rooster crowing dinosaur the T-Rex model in a different position?
No, that's I think that's a paint. It's an animation. It's just a silhouette of the dinosaur animated.
Okay. All right. Well, those are Scott's questions. Now, Georgie Mihela, I'm sorry if I don't know how to pronounce your name, Georgie, sent in this question here. Please ask him about his opinion of Siskel's "I would rather watch a movie about the cast eating lunch" review of Caveman. I guess together Mr. Siskel did not love the film.
Fuck him.
Well, it's a little late. He's gone. But, that film, I remember that film doing very well with some critics, and some people didn't seem to get it.
That was the problem. And the producers were kind of, it was Larry Terman and David Foster. They didn't know what they had, really. They were not comedy guys. They had attached themselves to the project. They were instrumental in putting Rudy DeLuca on it. My first drafts are a very, very different version. It was Rudy DeLuca who helped make it what it is. But Rudy's agents had told him that if the script was picked up, he would get to direct it. But I already had it in my contract that I would direct it. So when we got the green light based on our collaborative script, I had the unpleasant duty of calling Rudy and saying, "Good news, we got the green light, we'll go." And he said, "Great." And he said, what about directing? And I said, "Well, I'm directing." He said, "Well, I thought we would direct it together." And I said, I really don't think that's a good way to make a movie. This was before the Coen brothers, of course. So I'm not willing to share the director, and by contract, I don't have to. So he said, "We'll see about that." And then he went off, and he was very unhappy, and I don't know if he changed it. Anyway, he was very unhappy. We didn't talk after that.
Oh, well, that's sad. Rudy, I always thought it went great with Rudy. We worked together a few times. And
he took something that we wrote together and put it in Mel Brooks' History of the World.
Really?
That's a scene that's paralleled in Caveman, of the invention of music.
Oh, well. You also were you contributed to a couple of films like Amazon Women on the Moon.
Yes,
you directed certain sequences in there and such. This is a silly question, but given the choice, would you rather direct, act, or write? I mean, obviously you might want to do all three, but if you were forced at gunpoint to pick one.
of the three, acting is the most fun because it's the highest visibility and the least amount of intellectual work. You know, you show up on the set, you go to your trailer, you learn your lines. Somebody comes and gets you when it's time to go shoot. Somebody brings you a coffee and a donut if you want one. They bring you anything you want. You have public recognition when the movie comes out. They put your picture in the paper. You know, if you're lucky, the picture's a hit and you get hired for other stuff. And you don't have to sit alone with an empty screen in front of you or empty page, agonizing. Like some, I forget who the line is credited to. He said, "Writing is easy. You just sit down at the typewriter and open a vein."
During the 70s and 80s and on that period, when you made out your income tax, what did you put in the space under occupation?
I put a writer, actor, producer, because I got to take all the deductions for wardrobe and location expenses and research. You know, anywhere I went traveling was research. The law deductions were pretty lax in those days. I always filed long form Schedule C.
Is after Jaws, is the movie of yours people most want to know about The Jerk?
Yeah, The Jerk and
Dr. Detroit?
Dr. Detroit, not so much, although I was a matchmaker on that film too. You asked me about matchmaking Ringo and Barbara. They both started Caveman with their individual separate partners. Ringo was,
and eventually they were both the voice of Garfield. Got
yeah.
it. Okay. Yes. All right.
And Ringo was going with a photographer named Nancy Andrews, and Barbara was going with some industrial and Italian industrialist who was the father of her children, I think. And then when we got to location, I had a party for the cast at my house before we left for location, and their eyes met across the room, and they hooked up at the party. And then 8 weeks later in Mexico City, when we've been shooting for a while, we're rehearsing the seduction scene in the cave with Ringo and Barbara. And we're rehearsing in Barbara's room because she had a king-size bed, and I had built the set as the same size as a king-size bed so I could rehearse. So Ringo came over to Barbara's room, and I was there, and we rehearsed all the physical shtick that we were going to do the next day. And I went up to my room. Ringo stayed with Barbara, and the next day they showed up on the set holding hands and glowing.
Okay. And did that happen? Something similar happened on Dr. Detroit?
Similar. I'm working on the script, and Dan Aykroyd taking on. And each of the girls, there were three. The girls played the hookers: Fran Drescher, what's her name? Mrs. Aykroyd, Donna Dixon, Fran Drescher, Donna Dixon, and Asian actress. Anyway, they were all would express interest in me. They say, "Well, we should have a drink. We should get to know each other better." And I realized all three of them were trying to pad their parts. They were saying, because they knew the script was being rewritten, and they were looking to add lines. So I met with Donna Dixon, and I was talking to Aykroyd. He said, "What do you think of Donna?" I said, "She's smart. She's funny. I'm giving her a few more things to say." He says, "She's getting to me, Carl. She's getting to me." I said, "Well, good luck. You could do a lot worse in life." And sure enough, when we got back to LA, they hooked up and they've been together ever since.
Yeah. Okay, you say you're good luck.
Yeah.
I remember when you were doing The Jerk, and actually this question could probably apply to most of these movies, but when The Jerk was being filmed and you were playing Iron Ball McGinty, yeah. Did you have a sense this was going to be a big a hit as it was?
None of the movies I've been on, including the two icons, had any inkling during production or even after that they were going to be iconic. Jaws was a studio movie made under difficult studio conditions. The Jerk was a a negative pickup deal. It was passed by Paramount, had passed on it. David Picker left Paramount and went to produce The Jerk with Steve's management company. So they were both, workaday films where everybody was just trying to do the best job they could. And with the Fish movie, at the first previews, it was obvious it was going to be a big picture. Nobody knew how big. Everybody thought it would be a summer blockbuster, and then over. And that didn't happen. The Jerk, same thing. We knew it was going to be a successful Steve Martin movie, and Steve was just hitting his stride. It was the white suit days and the stadium concerts. He was doing very, very well. And shortly after, that's when he quit performing because he didn't like being a stadium comic, so he stopped. But at the time, we were just trying to make a good movie. That's all there was to it. I didn't even have time to do the final rewrite on.
Are you hiccuping? Is that? Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm going to take a sip of water.
Okay.
Yeah, I was hiccuping. Nobody knew. So I find the workaday rule for show business is if you just do every job the best you can, one thing will lead to another. You'll get more jobs, and if you're lucky, whatever you're working on will turn out okay. A lot of it is beyond your control. You can't control the release schedule. You can't control the marketing or the ad. So I didn't have any input, but the rewrite that was done by Michael Elias with Steve Martin was what put that movie over the top. It was Carl Reiner and Michael Elias. And the credits for The Jerk is story by Carl Gottlieb and Steve Martin, screenplay by Steve Martin, Carl Gottlieb, and Michael Elias. And he is as much responsible for the success of The Jerk as anything I did. And I'm sorry. And I turned the rewrite down because they wouldn't give me a point or a point and a half with my fee.
Okay, here's a real simple question. Was Carl Reiner as delightful to work with as people would think Carl Reiner was?
Yes. Carl Reiner was the nicest man in show business.
Yeah.
I only had one beef with him. I was producer of the Writers Guild Annual Award Show, and he was the host. And I went through a lot of trouble to prepare a script for him with his parts, carefully marked and where he was in the running order and all that. And I brought it to his house and I gave it to him. And the next day, when he was introduced, he walked out on stage holding my script and tossed it in the audience. Said, "They gave me this. I'm not going to do any of it." And of course, he did. He did do it. He did do parts of it. He did, but he denigrated the script. And
Is this something you do at a Writers Guild Award show? Do you come out and say, "I'm not following the script"?
Yeah. Well, he did the same thing at the Directors Guild. I mean, that was his shtick. He would say, and to his credit, he would wing pretty much the whole show. He would work off the moment. He would not do scripted material. He preferred to do it himself, and he did a great job by himself. So, I don't care. But I was a little pissed off.
Okay, well, you've led us now to the area I want to talk about before we close out here. We got a few more minutes here. I have been a member of the Writers Guild since about 78. You joined about 10 years before me, I'm going to guess. And I have been through, I don't know how many strikes or how many near strikes we've been. And I always looked to you for guidance. I voted for you every time you ran for office. And I always looked to you for guidance on what was really happening with the negotiations, with the contract, with the proposals and things like that. And I part of the question I want to ask you, I'm not going to ask you the question, how did you put up with that so long? I found working with the guild so time consuming and frustrating that after I had done a certain amount of it, I said, I've done my time. Other people can now volunteer for this stuff. I just couldn't give that much of my life to it. Now,
Yeah.
that's not the question I want you to ask. I want to ask you, but so I just admire you and a couple of other people who similarly devoted themselves to this. It seemed to me that I remember you explaining at the 77, I think we were on strike in 77, if I'm not mistaken, or 78, the one about pay TV, about the first pay TV formula. I remember you explaining from the dais at the, I think we were at the Palladium, the whole contract in such, the problem with the they were asking us to take the DGA pay TV formula, which didn't work for writers. It was one of those things where the DGA had made a deal that only helped the DGA, and we were expected to. Am I explaining this correctly?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
the contract that you're referring to was the 73 contract that the DGA had made. And it turned out, and we were
73 or 83.
Well, the long strike was 88.
The long strike was 88. 85 was when the strike collapsed.
Yes, yeah.
On us. That was the Ernie Lehman.
Yeah, that was also the Union Blues and Chetwin.
My old Chetwin, yeah. Ernie Lehman, great screenwriter, not great guild president, unfortunately. Sure. And then in '88 we had Brian Walton and George Kirgo, and we had. I thought the '88 strike was our punishment for folding in '85.
It was. I read it. I was co-chair of the negotiating committee for that strike, and in some ways, it was great. Great. I mean, it was awful for writers, but it was in '88 that David Crosby and I got a $500,000 advance to write his autobiography. So while we were on strike, I had a job in publishing that I was writing a book. I went off and wrote a book. I mean, I never missed a meeting or a negotiation, but I had something to do during that time.
Okay, it struck me that there were two. I'm going to ask you about two things here. There were two ongoing arguments within the guild. One of them was, to what extent should the negotiations be controlled by the board of directors, which is a bunch of writers who frequently are hired because they're superstar who are elected because they're famous as writers, versus professional negotiators, professional labor management people. There was the guy, and I can't remember his name, Gary something, who was our negotiator in 70 whatever. Yeah. And he kept, like, I talked to him a few times, and he kept telling me, you've got to convince the guild to stop letting writers call the shots. They've got to trust professional labor negotiators like me.
Yeah.
And so
John McClane took the same stance when he became executive director.
Yeah. So there's always this, and there's something actually kind of comparable going on at the Magic Castle now, where, should these decisions be made by professional magicians or by professional management people who maybe maybe lawyers or very versed in labor law and such. How do you feel about that? To what extent is our problem? Is it ever a problem that the board of directors is writers and not labor people, or is it a benefit that the balance between those two is what I'm interested in.
I walked a tightrope. I always stood up for the primacy of the board. The guild's long history, going back to the late 30s, was founded by lefties. John Howard Law, they were all a lot of blacklisted writers, and they founded the union, and they founded it on really kind of egalitarian, socialist orientation. And they were not, they weren't stupid, and they were incredibly selfless. William Ludwig, who was the treasurer, secretary treasurer for decades. He was still on the board when I was on the board. Bill Ludwig gave up his residuals on all the Andy Hardy movies in order to get them for the Guild in the negotiation in 68. Pre-68 movies were exempt. Bill Ludwig they were selfless, writer-centric guys. And the two experiments we had with, quote, professional negotiators was Naomi Gurian from the East, who was in many ways a disaster. Gary, what's his name?
Ellingsworth.
Gary Ellingsworth.
That's right.
Huge ears. And John McClane, who was kind of jammed down our throats by Frank Pearson, I was on the search committee that came up with John McClane. And his big selling point to the board was that he was a labor guy. And he was very frustrated because the labor guys, the board did not subscribe to his view of things. And the way Brian Walton came to us was he was our counsel in the negotiations, and everybody saw his work as a lawyer and said, this guy would make a good executive director, because the job of chief negotiator comes with the territory of being executive director. Executive director is the mouthpiece for the Guild and has to negotiate the contract. It's in the executive director's contract that he negotiates. So we got this very smart lawyer who was writer-centric, and that's how we got Brian Walton. And I've never regretted that decision. And when McClane left, nobody was sorry to see him go. And
but do you think that the Guild should be, to what extent should the Guild be run by writers?
It should always be run by writers. But
to what extent should they defer to professional negotiators, professional lawyers?
There's plenty of opportunity for the Guild to meet its professional staff, ranging from the executive director to the general counsel to deputy executive director. And we always had great people in those jobs. Chuck Slocum, Tony Siegel, Marshall Goldberg, who was a lawyer and a writer, displaced in a power grab in internal Guild politics. But the board, now, I personally believe that the board was hijacked in the election that brought Patrick Verone to power. That's when they fired McClane and hired Brian Walton. But in retrospect, it wasn't so terrible. But at the time, I thought it was a betrayal. But I did argue for the primacy of the board. I mean, if there's a
I'm confused here. Wasn't Patrick Verone long after Brian Walton?
No, he was on the board when they fired McClane and hired Brian. I think Patrick was part of that contingent.
I thought they fired Naomi and hired Brian Walton.
Well, Naomi was guilty. Oh shit. Fuck.
I thought Brian succeeded Naomi.
So where was John McClane in all of that?
I thought he was after Brian.
Brian is still there. Or was still there. Oh wait, no, wait. Oh fuck. I'm really confused.
Let's move off. That's not the thing I wanted to talk about.
Anyway,
I'm not talking about the specific people.
I prefer the writers to control their own destiny.
Okay, yeah, all right. Okay, now here's the other question here, which is, and every Hollywood labor union has this problem to some extent. In the Screen Actors Guild, it is said that most of the problems that they have flow from the fact that the Screen Actors Guild includes people who make $20 million a film and actors who are lucky to get 3 days work in a year. People who there's such an income disparity there and a success disparity that it is tough for the guild to serve both at the same time. When the Writers Guild has gone on strike, as we do every hour or so, it seems like, there is always this issue that you hear that the people who are working, everybody kind of in the guild divides into writers who work all the time and writers who almost never get any work. There obviously is a middle ground, but they tend to identify with the people they want to be or the people they're afraid of going back to being.
Welcome,
Okay.
welcome to show business.
Yeah, okay. So the people who are working all the time when we go on strike are saying, this strike is taking its toll on us. We're the ones who are walking out on actual jobs. We're the ones who have projects that are going to get killed by this. We're the ones the network is screaming at to try to break the strike and get back to work. We're the ones whose careers are really suffering from going on strike. The people who don't work, they have other sources of income. They weren't going to work anyway. They're not walking out on real money. They're not walking out on real jobs. We are the ones suffering. And in the meantime, the people at the low end of this, the people who aren't working very much, if at all, are saying, we're the ones who are suffering. We're the ones who needed the job we're going to get next week. We're the ones who have a project pending which is going to get killed. The guys who are working all the time, they can go to Hawaii and just collect residuals and write something that they can sell after the strike is over. But we're the ones who have to go out and march on the picket lines and suffer and see our careers go away and such. Now, you've heard this argument in every strike.
I've heard it a million times. Brian Walton once said, we have a membership that would prefer the dignity of being on strike to the ignominy of being unemployed.
Well, there are guys who like the fact that when they are picketing, they are spending the afternoon walking around a studio with name writers and hanging out with their income at that moment is exactly the same as J.J. Abrams. You know, I mean, they're.
I would venture to guess that one of the unseen, unintended consequences of a strike is a lot of collaborations and projects are begun on the picket lines with people who are just walking around talking about things that they always wanted to do, and you find somebody. So after the picket line is over, you say, well, you want to get a beer, and you go get a beer, and you wind up, registering a script together that you just wrote. I've done that. Everybody's done that. But the strength of the guild, and again, this goes back to our roots in the 40s and the 50s, is that our most powerful members, who are the showrunners and creators, are financially independent, but they'll take the hit for their fellow writers. The only reason the strike succeeds is because 150 or 200 showrunners closed down their shows. Reality television got its start in '88 because nobody would write a show, and there was no September season in '88 or '89. So I think it's a tribute to the mutually cooperative, collaborative nature of writers, because we understand collaboration certainly more than actors, and certainly more than directors. The movie only has one director. It's got sometimes 20 writers. Television shows have 10 writers. We understand collaboration. We appreciate it. We know how much good work can be done by collaborating. So if it comes to negotiating wages and working conditions, including how collaborations are compensated, we're out there, and we rely. One of our most articulate members for a while when I was on the board was David Goyer, who didn't need the guild for anything because he wrote Call of Duty. He wrote a billion-selling video game that he owned a piece of. So. That's why you got to love the guild. That's why I spend so much time there. It's because people actually put the collective good of the community of writers ahead of personal greed.
Okay. Well, you are an example, Carl. I admire you as a writer and a performer and a director and a person who's involved in so many good things, especially funny things. And it was present at, you were around Steve Martin, and you were around. I'm blanking on some of the movie MASH alone. Being in the movie MASH alone, you were present for a movie that changed the way motion pictures did, and Jaws probably spawned more imitations than any movie that was ever made. And Jerk was followed.
Jaws also changed the business model. The summer blockbuster release never existed before Jaws.
That was the first time we all heard the term tentpole movie, tentpole release. Yes. Yep. Anyway, and I just always admired also what you did for the Writers Guild. And like I said, you were always the person I went to when I was confused about what was at stake and what the studios were doing to us and why we needed to be on strike. And I plagiarized a lot of things you said when I was talking to other people about that. Yeah. And I thank you for spending this time with us here. We're going to wrap this up. There's a few questions that I think we kind of covered some of these. Folks in the chat room, thank you for your questions. I'm not going to get to any more of them. I want to let this guy go because he's
I don't mind doing another question or two if there's
okay. I'll give you one here. All right. Robert Rose, if another Jaws question is allowed, I am curious as to how Carl got involved, considering everything else on his writing resume seems to be comedy. Now, you were hired as an actor first, right?
Yeah, well, you got to remember, my agent at the time was Mike Bedavoy, who was very early to come to the concept of packaging and synergy. And Mike Bedavoy's class of '68 that he signed to the agency were me, Carol Eastman, John Milius, Steven Spielberg, Michelangelo Antonioni. So Bedavoy put me and Steven together and said, you guys should work together. So I was partnered with the young Steven Spielberg, who at that time was just a television director. I acted in a couple of his television movies as a day player, improvising my lines, and Steve would hang out at my house because in '68, '69, my house was kind of a salon, and everybody in the business would stop by. It was on Gardner Street, around the corner from the Oriental Theater. Convenient to all the record studios, and the rock and rollers from Walnut Canyon would be stopping by. My actor friends would stop by. Steven would stop by. And we wrote some stuff.
You were near the rock and roll Ralph's, they call it, the Ralph's Market, where you could go and always run into somebody who had to hit a record out. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And so Steve and I wrote some stuff, and we couldn't sell it because the deal was that Steve would be locked in to direct, and we couldn't sell anything with Steven locked in to direct because he wasn't Steven Spielberg yet. He was a young contract director at Universal, who was. Sid Sheinberg was his rabbi and had hired him on the strength of a very smart, short subject that he wrote and directed. So, so we were having no luck, but we were writing stuff together. And then Steve went off and did Sugarland Express, which was, Pauline Kael said it was the most astonishing debut film since Citizen Kane. But it made no money at the box office, and Steven realized he was preternaturally show business. Steven understood the business better than anybody. And he knew he had to have a popcorn movie. So he found the script to Jaws on Zanuck and Brown's desk, and he said, I'm going to do this movie. Why don't you come along and be an actor? You can help me with some of I'm going to be using a lot of local actors. You can help me with improvisation, and you know how to do that. So we'll hire you as an actor. So pick a part that's in the whole movie. So I did. So I was hired as an actor first. Then I wrote a long memo about he sent me the script, the Sackler draft, with a note on the cover that said, eviscerate it. So I wrote a memo, long memo, sent it to Steven. He showed it to Zanuck and Brown. They said, we want to meet this guy. So on a Sunday morning, I went out to the Bel Air Hotel for bagels and lox with Zanuck and Brown and Steven. We talked about the movie. I had two suggestions in my memo. One way off the mark, and the other one I was right on. I was way off the mark. I said, does the girl who has sex in the opening, does she have to die right away? That is such a horror movie cliche that if you're a teenager, if you're an attractive person and you have sex, you die. That's a horror movie cliche. We shouldn't do that. It seems, well, I think I have a way of shooting it. Okay. Then the other thing I said was, if we do our jobs right, people will feel about swimming in the ocean the way they felt about taking a shower after Psycho. And sure enough, on the 100 best horror films of all times, Psycho is #1 and Jaws is #2.
That's great. That's great. Well, we've come full circle here, Carl. I'm going to let you go here. I'm going to go hit the bathroom and something here. Thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your work. I appreciate you. And for those of you who came in late, this interview will repeat on YouTube ad nauseum forever, right where you're watching it right now. It'll start over as soon as I click here and end the broadcast. Thank you, Carl Gottlieb, and I will see most of you, I hope, next week for this. Good night.
Good night and God bless.